Hey everyone, so my name is Randy Kim from the Chronicles podcast, and I am very honored and so excited to have this next guest on. Her name is Brittany Spanos. She's a renowned music journalist and former senior writer for Rolling Stone magazine. Throughout her tenure at the magazine, she authored more than 15 cover stories profiling icons such as Lorde, Adele, Harry Styles, Janelle Monáe, and Addison Rae. And beyond her long form profiles, Spanos has gained acclaim for her insightful commentary on music history and internet culture. She currently produces BritPop, a newsletter where she reviews new music and rounds up the week's most essential pop news for a dedicated community of subscribers. And she has been also a recurring guest on DJ Louie's Pop Pantheon podcast, which this is how I found you, and I am an avid listener of that show, and I've
Yeah.
always appreciated your appearances on there. And I know that you recently left the Rolling Stone magazine and now transitioning to your own independent
Yeah.
Substack. And how has that transition been since leaving a Rolling Stone magazine after so many years?
I mean, it's been fun. I mean, I think there's a lot of, you know, a lot of fun exploring different things and working on different projects and, on the freelance side, working for different publications and editors and all of that, but also just on the more independent side of kind of managing this platform and engaging with people a little bit more directly has been really enjoyable and really, really fun.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and also I think it's kind of interesting to see the landscape of journalism these days,
Yeah.
especially in the age of AI and the economy and also the less investments that people are putting into the newsroom. And I'm curious about how do independent writers like you are trying to navigate this difficult climate.
I mean, it's really just keep keep writing in any way possible. I think that's kind of where we're all at is like I think everyone is, you know, in so many ways having to relearn, I guess, in the same way that we have had to relearn repeatedly of how to kind of maximize getting eyes on a piece and especially, really important piece or things that, are great for the general public to have access to or information on. And, um, I think that's such a big part of it now of like any way that we can sort of promote, self-promote, either, doing an independent platform like Substack or being a part of a publication is so critical right now of like just encouraging people to read. So, I think I think again, it really just comes down to keep doing it and keep writing. Like, I don't know. I think there's still, I think there's like answers none of us really have to it
Yeah.
in the moment. But I think the most important thing is as long as, you know, hopefully there's always still going to be people writing and being encouraged to do that. And I think that's the most important part.
Yeah, and I hope that people get a chance to follow on Brittany Spanos' Substack, and which I'm going to share in the episode notes. So I wanted to talk to you about Janet Jackson. Now, this has been something that I've been wanting to have a deep dive conversation for the longest time. And,
Yeah.
we're in a bit of a time crunch. So we'll see if we can try to encapsulate her entire legacy in
Yeah.
under an hour, if it's even possible. I know it's not going to be like the Pop Pantheon where there's like three different episodes, 2 hours each. And
Yeah.
so getting into an overview of her career, we look at the first two albums, Janet Jackson, her self-titled album in 1982, and Dream Street in
Hmm.
1984, which then, didn't break through until 1986 Control album. And during the period of 1986 to 2002, there was a period where she was just unstoppable. It was hits after hits. And this culminated in 27 top 10 hits, 10 of them which hit number one. She found success as an actress in Poetic Justice in 1993, and then The Nutty Professor 2 in 2000. She has sold over 100 million records worldwide, which makes her one of the best-selling music artists of all time. And then we go into the Super Bowl halftime show in 2004, which was the career turning point and how it would change how people viewed her and how she viewed her own career moving forward. And then, getting to the last couple of years with the revival of Janet Jackson, how has that been looking since the documentary that came out in 2021 through Lifetime? And what does it mean now? And as she turned 60 years old, which is very hard to believe, it's kind of like disorienting that, a lot of our older pop figures are reaching to that age. Like Madonna's almost 70 years old. She was performing with Sabrina at Coachella, and I'm very interested in having this conversation because I feel like Janet's career is still kind of a mystery to a lot of people because she was a longtime hit maker, revolutionary artist, with the music videos during MTV. And then all of a sudden it's been kind of like crickets in some ways. Like yes, she's still touring, she's doing residencies, but it doesn't have the same effect as say Madonna's Celebration tour or
Yeah.
the like it's kind of like she's along the lines of a New Edition or Boys to Men, which are basically trying to just keep their careers going versus like a star like Madonna or Beyonce, where they perform in arenas to stadiums. And
Yeah.
yeah, I'm curious about your own feelings about Janet Jackson growing up and what you saw of her.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up, I was born in the early 90s, so a lot of my pop culture fandom was really being molded by late 90s, early 2000s pop music. And so it was the Britney Spears, Christina Aguilera, NSYNC, Backstreet Boys, Max Martin pop moment. Um, and I think that particular time was so informed by Janet. It's like this was still a moment where, we were seeing Janet on MTV with Britney or with NSYNC or with, any of the artists of that time and alongside all of these artists as well with All For You and that album, of course, being as big as that was in the early 2000s. So I think there was this mix of, in the same way with Madonna, like these icons and also Michael Jackson to a degree at that point of like these are still like really big icons and legends from before I was even born and who were at like kind of the pinnacle of pop success the decade before I was born, who are still active and around and still and are now in that moment of being revered. So my relationship with her was very much in tandem with my relationship with pop music kind of
Mhm.
building and budding and growing and all of that. So, I became a big fan of hers over the years. I've always, I think I think she's, obviously one of the big blueprints of pop music now. Still, I think there's a lot of artists who would not be doing what they're doing without Janet as their blueprint. But yeah, I mean, I think it's been obviously very complicated in the time since the Super Bowl. It's been complicated even in recent years. I don't know that there's always, I think there's so many factors that kind of affect that legacy for her in a way that Madonna doesn't necessarily have. And I kind of I see them as like the two pillars of pop music in that
Mhm.
way and very kind of equal in that because I think pop music as we see it now are very much built from the two of them. Um, but it's very fascinating because I think it's, Madonna doesn't have the family aspect that Janet has, or the child
Mhm.
star aspect that Janet has of like her brother sort of looming over her career in ways that have at times been detrimental and at times, overshadowing her own talents. It's also Janet's a black woman in music and it was already a pretty incredible thing for her to defy a lot of the regulations around Black women and sexuality and continue to make the music as she did in the 90s and into the 2000s as she was aging and as she was, you know, reaching her, 30s and 40s that at a time like in that era was still so rare, I guess, for people to really accept that women age and can still be provocative and sexy and successful. And so, um, she really defied a lot of odds for so long. And then I feel like it's her legacy in this moment is still figuring itself out. Or how to, I guess, maintain that legacy in a specific way is still figuring itself out.
Yeah, what's interesting was when she started out, she was a child star and she was on Different Strokes, and I'm losing the name of the other Good Times.
Mhm.
And and when she was starting her music career, this was not by choice. Her father, pushed her into the music industry, and she released her self-titled album in 1982, also same year when Thriller came out, as a 16-year-old, and that album really didn't do well. Um, Follow up to like 1984, that album, Dream Street, also didn't chart very well, but also there was so much. Well, this was also around the Michael Jackson Thriller era. Thriller era where it basically swallowed all the attention, and then you got Prince's Purple Rain soundtrack, and yeah, I wonder about what do you think was not clicking for Janet in that particular era as a teenage star?
I mean, I think just really trying to find her identity, I think it was so much her figuring out who she was as a artist outside of the Jackson family experience, of the Jackson Five, of her brother having just found his identity. I think that was such a big thing about Thriller was that it was massive on so many levels, but was also such um a moment of Michael himself figuring out his own identity as an adult pop star. So Janet was still younger, she was still a teen pop star, I think still had the trappings and boundaries that a teen pop star sort of confined in into what they can do or
Mhm.
what people want to hear from them or what they can say. So, I think so much of it was just, it really was not clear to the world who Janet Jackson was outside of the Jackson family still. Like I think that really was what it came down to. And I think we've seen that repeatedly so much with child stars, with you know, celebrities from huge like show business families, or who have siblings or parents who are very famous. Like I think of even just like a Sabrina Carpenter, where it
Mhm.
took so long for anyone to really like figure out what her thing was, because she was taking so long to figure out what her thing
Mhm.
was, or like what the identity was outside of child star and things like that. So, it wasn't a super uncommon, I guess, like road those first couple of albums of her kind of not taking off in the same way that her brother was.
Yeah, and then she struck gold in 1986 with the Control album, and this came right on the heels of her quick elopement to James DeBarge, her husband, and
Mhm.
then also getting out of the control from her father, and this would uh, create the Control album, where it was about her own independence as like a 19-year-old woman, and she also met with Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis. And what did those two bring to the table? Because instantaneously the magic just happened. And then also Paula Abdul, to also her credit with the choreography. I mean, you also saw Janet become very dedicated to that, which sets apart from her own brother.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean the music it grew up. I think that was a big part of it. I think there was something really fresh and, you know, exciting about the type of production that Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis are bringing to it. Um, I think it was also just the perspective shifted in such a smart way. Again, like the concept of control, the concept of carving out that space of who she is and really bringing the identity and also really emphasizing the things that she is so special at, which she's an incredible dancer and she's extremely charismatic and she has this like really kind of, almost like cat like sex appeal to how she approaches performance and approaches her own stage and video and song presence. So I think this was such a great moment of all those things converging and all those things becoming really great pop weapons for her. And also, again, like just carried again by the fact that it's really great pop songs created with these two really smart and brilliant producers.
Yeah, I think what really struck me about Control was that it was both hard and tender at the same
Hmm.
time. I mean, you had like "What Have You Done for Me Lately" and "Nasty," where she like had this memorable line, "Don't call me baby, I'm Janet, Miss Jackson if you're nasty," which was a very bold statement for a 19-year-old to be saying, and I think that really sent the shock waves and like, wow,
Yeah.
this is a very confident person that knows what she's talking about.
Yeah.
And Control was the autobiographical song. And you look at Let's Wait a While and Pleasure Principle and When I Think of You, which is like the more tender, loving songs. And When I Think of You is like really one of my favorite songs. And also her first number one song, which every concert that I've gone to, she will always remind people that it was her first number one song, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. And when we get to the Rhythm Nation album, you know, there was a lot of pressure for her to follow up from Control. And there was record execs telling her that you really need to make an album just as successful as Control. And there was always this fear of a sophomore slump, or is this whole thing a fluke? You know, like
Yeah.
because she's still having to answer Michael Jackson related questions, you know, by this
Yeah.
point. And so, what do you think made this album in particular a successful one and avoided the sophomore slump?
Yeah, I mean, this album had such a defining image to it, the kind of uniform that she was wearing on the cover and in the video, and this like very kind of obviously leans more socially conscious in the lyrics, I think is a really big statement from a young woman in pop music to make and to do, and sort of in her own songwriting and in her own presentation. I think even at that time feels like sort of like this brave act from a woman in pop music to make any sort of like strong statement like that. I think we take for granted the fact that there were so many decades of pop artists who just avoided doing that, and it was so rare to have someone like a Janet or anyone to kind of speak up in those ways. And so, but yeah, I mean, it was also like a lot more musical experimentation, um, a lot more kind of her really just kind of growing who she was as an artist. Like I think that's so much a part of this is like she was still so much like experimenting with um, not identifying herself with like one specific sound or one specific kind of angle. Like I think of like Black Cat and that song, of course, being this like incredible kind of like heavy like rock cut in the middle of the album and how inspirational that song has been to, it's like people like Rihanna and Britney Spears and Beyonce have all cited that song is like really influential on them.
Mhm.
And that was such a rarity in pop music for a Black woman to make this kind of like heavy hair metal type song in the middle of her album.
Yeah, I think that's a great point that you bring up too. And also when you look at the Rhythm Nation song itself, I mean, the video was so iconic and like the dance moves were just so impeccable. Like I don't think I've ever seen anything like that. I mean, it was very much a game changer and it fed into the social consciousness with that song along with Black Cat and State of the World and the knowledge. So
Hmm.
this was like her way of trying to speak out on what was happening as a Black woman. And
Yeah.
and another part that people forget about is the song Miss You Much, which, you know, for a while it was on TikTok, you know, people were doing the dance craze to it. But what people do forget, and somehow, I don't know how this gets hidden, but the famous chair dance that she would
Hmm.
do towards the end. I
Yeah.
mean, I'd like to see anyone that still do it because like right now there's like the TikTok challenge of people doing the Madonna squats at
Oh
the
yeah.
Drown World, which was still incredible. I mean, that was a signature dance move for her for a long time, you
Yeah.
know. But yeah, like, what else songs really do stand out to you about that album? Because this had 7 top 5 hits, which was a record at the time.
Yeah, I mean, I've always really loved Escapade. That one's been
Mhm.
a favorite of mine. Um, yeah, I mean, I am like a huge Black Cat fan. I mean, the title track's like incredible. Yeah, I mean, it's just like it's such a mix. Yeah, it's like the in the same way that you described with Control of like the softness and the hardness. Like, I think there's such this like really great mix of moments like Miss You Much and Escapade, which are so like peak 80s pop songs, right? Like so like, in the vein of a great top 40 hit with these moments that are a little edgier and a little less expected of her or less expected to kind of be in contrast to those like very kind of peak 80s pop moments. So I've always really loved that contrast of it. But yeah, Escapade is definitely a favorite of mine.
Yeah, I think a song that really stands out to me that people forget about is Come Back to Me. I mean, the
Mm,
video to it is just, it's a very beautifully done video. I think it was shot in
Yeah.
Paris, and it's one of my favorite Janet Jackson ballads too. And I wonder what made her stand out by this point apart from her brother, because I think that she really needed to stand out from her brother. Like she wanted to be called Janet, which obviously will come into her next album, which was purposely titled as such so that she wasn't carrying the Jackson name. So I'm curious about what ways did she try to really stand out away from her brother?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's complicated because I feel like, again, like even just in terms of my own listening or like learning about Janet comes so much in tandem with Michael. And so I like to me, it feels like even at sort of these like dual peaks, I can't imagine that it was like very easy for people to even separate them still in that way. Like I think there was like that mix of competition happening, um, the mix of, the kind of older brother, little sister type of like dichotomy to that. I don't know. It's like I think I'm curious like what it was like in real time then, but for me they've always just been so intertwined. Like I think again it is already kind of incredible for her to have found success outside of that because it was a pretty daunting thing to do probably in terms of that post-thriller. Like your brother has made like the best-selling album of all time. To even be able to stand on your own in any capacity is pretty daunting for Janet to have accomplished it all. But yeah, I don't know. I still am not sure kind of how that even occurred in that time. I feel like that's sort of like the a thing that is pretty incredible about her and remarkable about her career. I think a lot of it for me is like the 90s. Her 90s pivot is to me more of that um of her really kind of solidifying herself as an artist, so unlike her brother and so outside of his kind of pop world. And so I think in the 80s to me it still feels so kind of I don't know, intertwined in some capacity in terms of the types of influences they're pulling from and the type of music. I mean, they both kind of had these moments of the kind of like metal, like hair metal leaning songs, right? Like they had like these like, but they were also still fusing like disco and R&B. Like they both were kind of in the same zone musically within the 80s. And I think the 90s for me is where that actual kind of separation of the two identities or of the Jackson sort of family identity becomes more prevalent and more apparent in Janet's own work.
Yeah, and I think 1993 was a very interesting year for her because
Yeah.
this was where she was really reaching the zenith of her career. Like Janet, the 1993 album, which had a long 2-year run, was like her biggest selling album to date. The tour was very successful. She was now digging into her sexuality and making her a sex icon, and which is very risky because Madonna right before that had the sex book, and she
Yeah.
got trashed by the tabloids, by the mainstream media for it. And so for her, it was kind of like a calculating risk. I don't think she went as far as Madonna did, but close enough because I think that in a way, like there were people that are like, well, what happened to Let's Wait a While? What happened to the Rhythm Nation social justice oriented person? So, but somehow she was able to surpass that. And um, there were many memorable songs. Tina Landon, became her choreographer, and you saw the Throb performance in SNL. Honestly, like one of the best house music songs out there. You
Mhm.
Want This, which had a very memorable video, and Because of Love again, which was the featured song on the Poetic Justice soundtrack and got her an Oscar nomination. That's the Way Love Goes had a good 7 to 8 weeks at number one. The If video, I mean, who could forget that incredible
Yeah.
bridge where she does her famous karate chop dance, And I think it's kind of wild, but at the same time, at the height of her career, she also had to deal with the allegations against her brother Michael, and in the documentary, she did briefly talk about that part where she was about to sign a deal with Coca-Cola, I believe. And when the allegations came out, they basically pulled that deal under the rug. And so I wonder how the scandals actually, in a way, maybe affected her and how she would proceed the rest of her career.
Yeah, I mean, that again, that's why so much of this, I I guess I don't know is exactly how to unpack the ability that she
Mhm.
had to separate herself in her music because of that. But also, it's very clear that there was just enough of that presence that she had as an artist to let her music be successful in its own right and like create and allow her to like create a legacy in her own right outside of her brother, but still because of the family-ness of the Jackson family careers and the intertwining of all of that for so long and the image that still existed, I think, in the public eye of Janet and Michael and of them being sort of the breakouts of their own family, of their siblings, um, you know, ended up coming back to really haunt them in that way, or to coming back to really haunt Janet specifically in that way of, no matter how much she had proven of herself in her career to that point and beyond, she still was going to be seen as Michael's sister, and still have to pay in some way for the things that he had been accused of or be related to it. That being said, she had always been a pretty staunch defender of him, and I think that's a lot of it as well. She stood by him through a lot of these allegations, and I believe continues to show support for him, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not sure in more recent years how she's spoken about it, but I know at least while he was alive and during sort of the peak of this, she did spend a lot of time supporting him, and I think that also is part of it as well.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, I don't know. It's a complicated sort of thing just
Mhm.
because this was a family band, like this was like
Mhm.
these were all siblings who were trying to break out. I mean, the same way we think of any pop group of, we're always going to think of Harry Styles as part of One Direction, right?
Mhm.
Like we're always going to think of Justin Timberlake as being part of NSYNC. Like no matter what, that never leaves them. And obviously, it's
Mhm.
even crazier when your, siblings like are
Mhm.
also trying to like break out. And it's very clear, again, obviously all the siblings were trying to break out in their own way. But yeah, I mean, Janet broke through in the way that Michael did, and obviously that made her more of a liability when those allegations
Mhm.
became public.
Yeah, and she really doubled down in her defense of Michael with the song Scream that she
Hmm.
did with her brother. It was the only collaboration that she's well, I mean, she did do the backing vocals of PYT with her sister Latoya and Michael,
Yeah.
but this was their first and only official
Yeah.
collaboration. Music video was out of this world. I mean, you look at this video, it's like, wow, you would not have thought that this was made in 1995. I
Yeah.
mean, it was one of the most expensive videos ever made, and it, I mean, just iconic. I don't think that there's any words behind it, and then she released her Design of a Decade, which is kind of like a greatest hits compilation,
Yeah.
and the song Runaway became a big hit. She had the song 24 played, which is a long forgotten song, but in that music video, she was trying to play the role of Dorothy Dandridge, which
Hmm.
would later go to Holly Berry. And I think this is kind of where she was trying to um, think about what to do after this big monstrous success. And then, dealing with the fallout of her brother's scandal. And then this would lead to the Velvet Rope. And it felt I think when I was a 14-year-old kid, I was very excited about this Janet album, but it was a very different Janet.
Hmm.
Like in the cover of the album, you don't see her face, you see her looking down.
Yeah.
And you look at the video To God Till It's Gone with Q-Tip, and it's very laid back. It it's pretty much more of her in the background just singing along, and then like she had a completely new hairstyle. She wasn't trying to stand out in some way, but she was just kind of like more of a in the backdrop, and I thought that was a very interesting choice of a
Yeah.
first single and how she came into that album. I don't know if you have any thoughts, because this was her album that's probably her most personal. I mean, she spoke about depression, she
Yeah.
talked about queerness, which became a queer album for a lot of folks. She talked about marital abuse, and and all of the things on that
Yeah.
album. So yeah, what were your thoughts on that particular album?
Yeah, I mean, it's so again, like I think her 90s output is so interesting and so again, the thing that really I think is so defining to her legacy and so defining to how we think of and celebrate Janet Jackson as an artist now and still. But yeah, I mean, I think this album kind of it feels like such a fusion of the the beginnings of the social consciousness that she expressed in Rhythm Nation and in that album and kind of where her mind even was at that point and obviously was able to take it so much further and so much deeper with Velvet Rope and again, like you said, like intertwine it with the personal aspect, intertwine it with the sexuality that's so important and on her self-titled with Janet. I think this was a moment of her image very drastically shifting. I think even from Control and Rhythm Nation, those albums were still like a little bit more conservative in her own expression of her body and her sexuality and her as like a um, you know, kind of not necessarily, I don't know, maybe I'm trying to think of like the right word to describe it because it's so
Mhm.
much, you know, so many more layers than just like being like a sex symbol in that way. But I think at least in the 90s, she was able to explore being an artist, being a grown woman who can talk about sex and sexual intimacy and combine that with these conversations about mental health, about social issues, about, the world at large. And, I think this album as kind of this really conceptual piece still holds up in so many ways.
Yeah, it's also one of our most critically acclaimed albums. And
Hmm.
also, the tour behind the Velvet Rope was a massive success. I think that's probably one of my favorite live performances that she's done on tour. And also, like during this time, like she after the tour was over, she also later got a divorce from Rene Elizondo Jr., her second husband, and this was a secret marriage she kept for 8 years, and which
Hmm.
blows my mind to this day. Like one thing about Janet that sets apart from like the other pop stars, is that she values her privacy, big time, and also that when she's not doing an album cycle, she kind of goes into her Sade hiatus. Like you don't really
Hmm.
hear from her, and I think in a way like the idea of attracting fame the way Madonna seeks it out is very different. Like I think that she's very averse to that. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a big element. I think that was part of what both her and Michael experienced. I think that was like kind of the separation of them, even with their own siblings. It's like they very much they saw what it looked like to become very famous, and Janet had experienced that firsthand from a very young age, and um, then experienced it again as she became a young woman who was pursuing this career and on her own and wanting to be a celebrity and or not wanting to be a celebrity, but wanting to not necessarily be a celebrity, but be an artist and be a very successful at being an artist. And so, I think that was so interesting about the Velvet Rope and about the marketing behind it because obviously there was the kind of shock value of the eroticism of the self-titled.
Mhm.
And I think she was able to sort of harness a little bit of that still, but find a way to do it in a way that um, allowed the songs to speak first rather than the shock of like, having like the Rolling Stone cover with her boobs covered with,
Mhm.
her partner's hands or something.
Mhm.
Like, I think there was this kind of balance for her of like, okay, how can I continue to dig deeper into this subject matter that feels really important as an artist, but also experiment with the presentation of it and experiment with how I want to present myself as the face of it or what that means to shroud my face in these moments or play with my public image. But yeah, I think it's always been so fascinating how much she has really shied away from the celebrity aspect of pop stardom more so than most other women
Mhm.
in music and women in pop culture and women at her level especially just because I don't know I don't think a lot of them have had the choice either way but um she really kind of figured out the best way to kind of let herself exist a little bit more little bit more privately. But again, I think very very largely informed by the child star aspect, by
Hmm.
the continuing Michael stuff at the time. It's like all of that kind of I think gave her more purpose to be like I need to protect myself a little bit more.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point because she's been a child star since she was practically 2 years old. And
Hmm.
so, like, if you see her interactions on a normal, like the glimpses that you do see, she hangs out with her dancers quite a
Yeah,
bit. And so she values having friends that are not celebrities. They're
yeah,
just people that she works very closely with in collaboration. So I think in some ways that there's this yearning need for normalcy in
yeah,
her life that she felt like she was robbed of. And when we look at the All For You album, which would come out in 2001, this came off the heels of The Nutty Professor and her successful song Doesn't Really Matter, another number one hit. She was celebrated by MTV as one of their icons, and there's this amazing display, like Pink and Maya, Aaliyah presented, Outkast, and you had like a number of celebrities that were giving her shine. And by this point, she was in her mid 30s now,
yeah,
and this is kind of where this is kind of like you're at a crossroads. As a woman, as a black woman, there's very few outliers that can go past it, like say a Tina Turner, maybe Cher for an example. But like in her mid 30s, this also came with the rise of the teen pop era of the Christina Aguileras and Britney Spears, the NSYNCs. And then for the R&B side, it was Brandy, Monica, Aaliyah, Maya, Alicia Keys. And how do you think she was viewed by how do you think she was viewed during this time by the general public 35-year old, and how do you think she was still thriving when the competition felt very stiff?
well, I think a lot of it is there is a very clear through line in pop music from Janet, Madonna, and Michael and Prince. Like, it's like one of those things where it's never been more like transparent that every single pop star of the late 90s, early 2000s were heavily inspired by some combination of those four artists. And, the fact that, and I think on top of that, those artists still felt so recent. It's like it was not that long since, they were still actively releasing music. They were all still actively touring. They were all still pretty young, um, and still like, working and still very present, and touring and performing at the same way that they had done for the last, you know, at that point, like 15, 20 years of their, for at least, for Janet and Michael, their solo careers. But, um, it was like one of those things where it was like it wasn't like the influences of these pop stars were going back beyond this, like going to the 70s or for artists who no longer were actively performing. It's not like they were all pulling from the Beatles, I mean,
Mhm.
obviously Paul's, but you know, like they weren't
Mhm.
pulling from an era that felt very bygone. Like this era still felt so hugely influential and still so hugely like present still and still existing. So it was kind of a fascinating intersection at that time because I think remembering just my own experience of it, I was like, it's like those artists were still like, they were still releasing new music. It's
Mhm.
like we have um like Janet, of course, like like still had, Velvet Rope is still kind of lingering. All For You is about to come. Like I remember when All For You came out. I
Mhm.
remember that album still feeling so important in my life, and it still is one of I think it's still my favorite album of hers. And or even like Madonna doing Confessions, like those
Mhm.
albums were so big in those moments, but then also there was that extra layer of like these teenagers and 20 somethings who I am obsessed with and listen to only exist because of these artists or like are so heavily inspired by them. So
Mhm.
it was such an interesting dichotomy that I think we experience now in a little bit of the similar way. um that like but I think when we think of artists, even the artists that they were inspired by, a lot of them burnt out really fast or like
Mhm.
weren't performing still or kind of were like a little bit more of a bygone era that passed very quickly. And it was interesting to kind of be able to celebrate these artists as they were also still in competition with the artists that they sort of created in a way.
Yeah, and I think when I think of the All For You album, that was also a game-changing album for me.
Hmm.
As a soon-to-be 18-year-old, I remember the prom night, and when All For You came on, I was dancing my butt off and kind of won Best Dancer of the Year by my class because of that song, which I will always be thankful for. It was like one of the biggest songs of that year, followed by Someone to Call My Lover, another top 10 hit that she also grabbed along the way. And then we get into fast forward to 2004. Janet is now in her late 30s, and she was now going to be the headliner for the Super Bowl halftime show. And what the halftime show did was expose Janet, no pun intended, as a person who was relatively unscathed for years in the public eye. Not like a tabloid drawer like her brother, or Madonna, or Whitney, or Britney, but she then after that show, she became an overnight punchline, for late night talk shows, and it went beyond that. Like she would lose the role of playing Lena Horne for the biopic because Lena basically said, "I don't want her, betraying me anymore." And then you've got like radio stations and MTV pulling out their music playlists, uh, her music away from her, away from um, just not playing them, period. And so, like, it was kind of astonishing to see how quickly a career just vanished overnight. And she was about to release the Demeter Joe album. Unfortunately, had the competition of Usher's Confessions album, which was already a massive, massive hit. And this was the first time that she yielded no top 40 singles, which was surprising to me. I mean,
Hmm.
when you think of On Night, that should have been at least a top 10 hit. It's a favorite of many Janet fans. And
Hmm.
I Want You, which was produced by Kanye West, who was very much a rising star that year.
Yeah.
Yeah, why do you think her career diminished so quickly, and why do you think it has taken this long for her to regain her
Yeah.
relevance? Yeah.
I mean, I think it was a combination of a really bad convergence of things that were happening in pop culture, but also things that sort of followed throughout her career, which is the fact that, the first thing is that Black women have very different respectability politics that they must adhere to in their careers and in their presentation. I think, again, that's why it was so striking, but also captivating and trailblazing that Janet the album and Velvet Rope were successful and were so because they were also so artfully and masterfully done and sort of delivering much more kind of erotic subject matter or presentation or lyrics and things like that. So, it was already incredible that she could break through in that way, but obviously, again, much of her career up until that point had been a much more sort of conservative presentation to adhere to what the public expected of a young Black woman in pop music. She wasn't going to be able to writhe on the floor
Mhm.
like Madonna. She wasn't going to be able to wear um, the same type of clothes that other female pop stars were wearing at the time. Like, I think there was a very different expectation that she was always upheld to. Um, and was able to prove herself artistically for so long as someone who can kind of convey many many multitudes of things in her music and in her presentation. But we enter in the 2000s. She's one, older, um two, like you said, gone pretty unscathed publicly for a very long time. We're now in the Bush administration. The
Mhm.
politics of the US were changing very rapidly. Sex education was being replaced with abstinence programs in schools. We were in a pretty, hyper Christian type of mentality of pop culture in America. So, what was expected of women at that time, of people on any public platform at that time, was very different, especially again for Black women. And given again the fact that she's a Black woman who is getting older, a Black woman who was on stage with a beloved white man who at that time was very much seen as a kind of, and like kind of divine pop prince that
Mhm.
people were really excited about. Um, she was the sacrificial lamb in that. And I think there were so many elements of the whatever the Viacom guy who was
Mhm.
the guy who
Les Moonves.
yeah, I was like, what was his
Yeah.
insane name? Les
Yes, it is.
Moonves having it out for her. Um, at that time, Justin's pretty terrible way of
Hmm.
defending her and basically just like getting off scot-free. Like, I think there was just so many elements to it. And I think given, I don't know, even just the way it happened, like, it's like you see, I don't know, it's just like, I feel like people just wanted to be able to pinpoint someone as the blame for
Hmm.
it because viewers were upset.
Hmm.
And the person that they had to blame was Janet because it was her boob. And
Yeah.
so, it's like it was just it's kind of ridiculous all around, and it's
Hmm.
so ridiculous when you think about it
Hmm.
now, where you're just like, how did this like even
Hmm.
escalate to that point? And I mean, but then again, like we see it all the time. Like it's like one of those
Yeah.
things where, even just like a month ago, people wanted like, Chapel Roan's head on a platter because she like didn't like wasn't nice enough to a child. Like, it's like stuff like
Hmm.
that where it's like, and then you watch the way people talk about it for,
Hmm.
and obviously these are not like one-to-one experiences for sure, but like, we watch it in real time in social media where it was later revealed that most of the people who were tweeting about it were bots. And like it was like not a real, it wasn't a real sort of dialogue that was
Hmm.
existing. People just fell for this like um, you know, programming to hate a
Hmm.
woman. And at that time, obviously, kind of pre-social media as we know it
Hmm.
now, but it wasn't much different. Like, the way that tabloids worked at that time, the way that celebrity culture worked at that time, they hated women. Like they really did. Like
Hmm.
they really hated, women after a certain amount of time. It's like, well, it's only a couple years later, people would be kind of chasing Britney Spears down
Hmm.
streets in LA, or basically like just laughing at Amy Winehouse several years later
Hmm.
until she died. I think there was this real hatred
Hmm.
for women, and I think again, like Janet being an older black woman and older in the sense of older than 21, like at that time, like it just meant that it was over for her.
Yeah, and I think that by the time she would do Demeter Joe, then she would release 20YO in 2006 and 2008, the Discipline album, all of which just did not chart well at all. And I think maybe in best summation, it was also important to note that she stopped working with Jimmy Jam, Terry Lewis for a time during 2006, and then for the 2008 albums, and I'm not a fan of 20YO. I This is an album I do not have I have a hard time going back to, but I will say Discipline I felt like deserved better. Like Feedback should have been at least a top five hit.
Yeah,
Rock With You should have at least charted at the very, very least, which blows my mind because that song to me is like one of my all-time favorite Janet songs. I don't know
yeah.
if you have any thoughts about those three albums in particular.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I just haven't spent a lot of time with them, and because I just the times when I did listen to them again, like you said, they're just like not as strong in that way. And I do love like Feedback is a really good song,
Mhm.
but I mean, it is interesting. I saw her live for the first time like maybe a year or two ago, and I
Mhm.
think pretty much that entire era is like not in her live shows even. Like I don't
Mhm.
think she did. I think
She
she
did
maybe
Rock With
just
You, actually surprised
yes.
me. I
Yeah,
was
I was like there was like
shocked.
one
Yes.
song from that moment that was in there.
And maybe On
Um
Night. And maybe On Night too, because that's a fan favorite.
yeah, I mean
Yeah.
I think for the most part it wasn't a lot. I think she had done some Demita. Maybe I'm
I think On Night's probably
no,
the only
yeah.
one. Yeah. Hmm.
And yeah, I mean I
Hmm.
know that a lot of that era ends up being kind of left on the table for that, but yeah, I'm curious what her relationship with it is with those albums now, but should go back and maybe try them again. But
I
yeah,
think
I mean
Demita
it
Joe
is
is a very underrated gem. I think
yeah,
people
Demita
sleep on
Joe,
that. Hmm.
more specifically 20-Year-Old in Discipline, I
Hmm.
like don't really, or
Hmm.
20YO.
Yeah.
But like
Jermaine Dupri
I
failed that one.
yeah, like those two I really don't like. Demeter Joe I go back to often, but yeah, those two I kind of don't spend a lot of time with.
Yeah, and I think like after that, it's like after the I hate the word failures, but after just not reaching the peak level that she was doing in the 90s into her 2000s, where she was just struggling to get traction, her brother Michael passes away.
Hmm.
Tellboys were kind of focused onto her too, um, and I think as she was grieving, she was also doing this memorable MTV tribute performance. And even though it was a very powerful performance, unfortunately, it got overshadowed by Kanye West and Taylor Swift, and
Hmm.
then maybe to a smaller extent, Lil Mama, like got jumping up on stage with Alicia Keys and Jay-Z. So it's like I just felt like this was another moment
Yeah.
that was ruined for Janet, and I think by this point she's kind of like I don't want to say given up, but like it felt like she was just retreating. I think after that performance, and she was doing her number ones tour. You know, it was done in theater
Yeah.
shows, and then she um married Sam, who is a billionaire, and she became very low key to the point where people were asking, "Well, where's the new music?" And this would come out to the 2015 Unbreakable album, which, yielded a minor hit in No Sleep with J. Cole, and it kind of like reignited her career. But then, it was kind of weird because she was also going through that divorce with Wissam. Like she was dressed more conservatively, and it felt like she wasn't really the Janet that we were accustomed to seeing. And it wasn't
Yeah.
until she divorced that and after being a mom, she became more of herself. And I think that's kind
Hmm.
of where the revival started to begin. The review of Justin Timberlake's personality and his public persona for the past 10, 15 years at that point. So I think that there was this revival. I mean, she got accepted to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and the Made for Now song, the 20 in 2018, her last song that she's ever released, to this date, was a another minor hit and a really beautiful video. So I think with that said, as we kind of start to wrap up, like with the documentary, we have seen that like at least this is my opinion. This is something I've shared with the Pop Pantheon before, but like it feels like Janet has not put a lot of focus on her legacy building the way Madonna and Mariah Carey recently have. And you get some glimpses of TikTok challenges, but struggles to get streaming numbers. Her YouTube numbers are very low, and she hasn't managed that channel well at all. And I feel like it's kind of a mess at the moment. Maybe it's just me, but I feel
Yeah.
like that's kind of what we're noticing because I'm like, she deserves better than what she's getting, in my
Yeah.
opinion.
I mean, wasn't part of the issue too? Isn't she being managed by one of her nephews now?
Her brother Randy, who's a mega,
Oh, her
by the
brother
way.
is. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think
Hmm.
that was a big part of the issue as well. Um, yeah, I mean, it's again, like I saw her a couple years ago, and I remember feeling, I guess, when was the Together Again tour? Was that 2024?
2023. It was 23 and
23?
24 and 24 too. Mhm.
Yeah, I think I saw it in 24 because I think it was the same year. Or no, I think I saw it 2023 because I think it was the same year I saw Madonna's Celebration tour.
Mm-hmm.
I remember it was like so fascinating seeing the two of them in you know, arenas the same year.
Hmm.
And like Janet's still a great performer. And I was just like
Hmm.
she has like three or four backup dancers the entire show. And it feels so
Hmm.
like it just feels so pared down in a way that I was like, I don't think this is
Yeah.
how a Janet Jackson show should be. Like I
Yeah.
was just really like I remember I was struck by that even before I went to the Celebration tour. And then I saw the Celebration tour and I was like, okay, like Madonna's doing like a full on like very expensive production. I'm like, this is like Janet should be doing the
Hmm.
exact same thing.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's not to diminish like I think Madonna is doing the exact was doing the exact tour that she should be doing. And I was like, but I want Janet to do a similar one. Like I was like,
Yeah.
why isn't
I want
she
it more
like
curated. I want it more
oh my
curated.
curated? Like it was just
And stop
it
with
was
the
a little
melodies too, because it drives
yeah,
me nuts. It's like I don't
yeah,
like to hear 1 minute of this. Like I feel like she tries to people please to the point where
yeah,
it's like there's like 40 songs, but she only does like 30 seconds of each. And I'm like, no,
yeah.
I'm happy to get rid of a couple songs if we can get the full version, you
Yeah,
know?
I was like, I don't know, let's do some like bring a man on stage, bring
Mhm.
some guy on stage and do like
Yes.
let's
It's
do
some
that. You know, it's
female
like,
dancers, backup
yeah,
dancers, because I mean that's also like like give more
yeah,
variety. And I feel like she's been
yeah.
repeating that same formula for a while. And I'm like,
I mean,
what's going on?
that was
Yeah.
the first time I had been able to see her fully, like seen her
Hmm.
live. And again, I had a great time at the show. I thought it was a
Yeah.
really great show, but it was striking to me and it made me really sad because I was just like, I was like, Janet deserves this type of big production.
Hmm.
Because again, like her legacy, you know, a lot of it self-maintains. And not a lot of artists can say that, where it's like a lot of it is just, you know, it's or like it's, you know, it's not self-contained, but like it's like sort of is maintaining itself, it's maintaining itself. And like um, you know, I think just in the fact that it exists, that she exists, that there are many artists who still cite her as their number one and still cite her as their biggest influence. I think it's really pleased me in recent years that the conversation about Britney Spears' own legacy as a pop star is constantly intertwined
Hmm.
with Janet. And I'm thankful that's more so than Madonna because, you
Hmm.
know, I think
Yeah.
obviously they worked together a lot and her and Janet didn't, but like Brittany
That's
is
the inspiration
is
there.
Janet's
Yeah.
daughter. Yeah, like it's like that's like her biggest inspiration. So I really personally love that that's become the new narrative of the last several years of Britney Spears wouldn't exist without Janet Jackson. You know, like that's like a really nice thing that's shifted. But yeah, I don't know. I don't really understand. I mean, I do understand because she's being mismanaged probably, but like I
Hmm.
think there's something lacking in it, and I wonder how much of it is the expectation of a proper comeback or like the anticipation of that in some way. Because I think sometimes that stalls an artist. I feel like I felt the same way about um, you know, Mariah off and on,
Hmm.
where like I think there was this. And I mean, I've loved Mariah's recent
Same.
albums. I think they've been fantastic. But you know, it's like sometimes you're gonna hit the charts again in the same way that you did before. Sometimes you aren't. Doesn't make
Hmm.
it any less impactful. So I was getting really annoyed because I was just like, I feel like she's just like focusing on the Christmas stuff so much, and I'm like,
Yes.
we got so much more we
I
could
know.
pull from. We have so much more we can um, do with that. I think it's shifting a lot more now. I think there's been, you know, a little bit of a reassessment of how to approach kind of the combination or the balance of um, her past career while also moving forward as an artist and continuing to release and tour and still make music and be an active artist without relying too much on just legacy. But yeah, I mean, I'm curious what that is for Janet so much. I mean, it does seem clear that she is celebrating her legacy in some way with the Together Again tours. A lot of it was so much about the greatest hits and about doing, I mean, also because it had been a while since she'd released new music. And so that was obviously the purpose of it. But I don't know really where she goes from here beyond that. Like, you know, is it, I mean, I don't think the right mode is of competing biopic or like anything else. Like the documentary was a good start to a lot of it, but I think there's so many other ways that she can be going harder in celebrating you know, her music and her legacy and getting it out there. I think it's been cool to see when it's like when her music's been sampled, of course, like thinking even just like Kendrick Lamar or, you know, him using anytime, any place, and that creating its own sort of revival. But, you know, I think we'll hopefully see more of that. I think hopefully it's she takes more control of it in the future because it would be a real shame to see that wasted in any way.
Yeah, totally agree with you. And as we wrap up, I think one of the advice that I would give to Janet would be like, you know, call Cardi B, call SZA up if they're on tour, make an appearance, like let people give you your flowers, I think
Yeah.
something like that would really help her legacy, and in closing, what would be a song that would be the song that you would be like, yeah, this is my Janet song forever.
It would probably be Someone to Call My Lover. I'm
Hmm.
such an All For You fan. I think that album is so fantastic all the way through. And I think Someone to Call My Lover is a song that I genuinely would put in like my top 10 songs of all time. Like if I had to listen to it for the rest of my life, I very easily could listen to just that song for eternity.
Yeah. For me, when I think of you, just
Yeah.
one of my favorite charming songs. And Brittany, it was so great to talk to you. Thank you so much
Thanks
for
for
going through
having
this
me.
deep dive. And
Yeah.
yeah, all the best to you.
Thanks. All the best to you as well. Thanks.